Welcome to Intelligent Human Leadership, leading yourself and your team. Do you ever find yourself grappling with a lack of confidence in your team? Or battling the relentless waves of concern and fear? Are the pressures to meet client expectations and the burden of missed opportunities weighing you down? On this podcast, you'll discover the strategies and insights that will reignite your team's morale and help you find the harmony and knowledge you seek to propel your business forward. Here, we explore innovative ways to reignite your creative spirit and achieve greatness, empowering you to lead with intelligence, compassion, and resilience. If you're ready to dive deep into your core of leadership challenges and be guided toward success, here's your host, founder of Steward Your Business, David Carr.
Welcome back. So glad to have you here on the Intelligent Human Leadership Podcast. I am honored to be your host and guide here, David Carr, Steward Your Business. And today I thought I would bring up the question or observation of where and how we're communicating. You've heard communication is key in a lot of different ways in relationships and environment, and where we're working day to day. And so this idea of communication and where we're communicating affects how we communicate. And so there's a big divide today. We're not all in an office. That used to be the case for professional services in particular. Industry I've grown up working in over 25 years. Man, I'm getting old. No, it's all good. But with the work that we do, office, and for those of you that are listening and haven't put it together, I've been a biologist in my career and working in environmental consulting. I spent a lot of time outdoors as well. And now we have remote work on top of that, which wasn't the standard a few years ago, but now has become one of the primary ways people work, is they're not coming into an office. So we've got this kind of great communication divide, if you will, between the office, working those that work outdoors, and those that work remotely. Their office is their home, and their home is their office. So based on that, do you think we're going to have a little problem having some communication issues at times? Yes. Hopefully you're all nodding your heads as you're listening or watching this. Yes, we have some communication problems or challenges here. And so why I bring this up is the Intelligent Human Leader Podcast is all about being that intelligent human leader, communicating well, having emotional intelligence, leading yourself well, then in turn leading your team. So if you're struggling with this, and we've got a wide range of ages in the marketplace, from Gen Z to all the way up to baby boomers and maybe even traditionalists beyond that. But we've got a wide range of forms of communication, and it's challenging. It's challenging depending on where you're at on the spectrum. Some of you may love it. Some of you may just drive you crazy with all the different forms of communication. When I grew up, there was basically phone calls and letters. That was it, for the most part. And so the forms of communication have exploded over the years. And some of that's great, and some of it causes us challenges. So I want to just start, and I'll kind of go through these a little bit with you. We'll start with the traditional office setting, which most of you are probably familiar with. But maybe there's some of you that have never worked in an office, and believe it or not, that's becoming more common as I've been working with clients and individuals. And so how do you navigate this? What's the new normal? Well, what we used to have was these hierarchical structures and bottlenecks and literally physical barriers in an office that could contribute to miscommunication, breakdowns. It could also help with informal communication sometimes, depending on how the environment was set up. in my program, Steward Your Business and Steward Yourself program, my whole point is creating an environment in which is conducive to communication, sharing, collaboration. However, that's not always the case. I worked for a large engineering firm as a part of my career, had tens of thousands of people in the organization that had offices really around the world. And I found, coming from at that point working for the county of Riverside, and I'd worked for another private consulting firm, the communication barriers were higher than I had imagined they were going to be coming into the organization. I thought, oh man, this is going to be great. I'll be able to get all these resources and access these different people. And I was able to, but it wasn't as easy as I thought it was going to be. Again, there was just these breakdowns and segments, and I was like, man, how do we communicate here? It was not flow, wasn't natural. And sometimes in these cases too, because you're at a physical location, there can be office politics or dynamics in there. There can be challenges on the way you communicate formally or informally. And so, there's ways there that, while positive in some regards, coming into the kitchen, if you will, in a shared working space could be great. I worked in a shared office location, and so there was ways to meet up with folks or get a shared conference room. Great. I think those are good opportunities and ways we can use the traditional office setting to help us communicate better and create an environment that's conducive to collaboration. Designing office spaces that can promote that way of collaboration. When I used to work at the County Riverside, we called it the bullpen, where I was in the same kind of general area with my colleagues, and we could, roll our chair over to each other or talk with each other freely and connect. And if we needed more time or areas to think and focus, we could also find those as well. So, knowing how to communicate well and to create a space that is conducive to sharing. Sometimes that isn't always the case. It's a challenge. One of the areas I worked before, where we had a lot of cubicles close to each other, which in some ways are good, we can talk with each other, walk over real quickly. But then when you're all on calls, or that can be noisy and it can be a little messy, if you will. So the traditional office setting can be conducive, but it also can be challenging. And just think about this in how you communicate, how you like to be communicated to and communicate with others. If you're on a lot of calls, that can be a challenge. When you're in a small office setting, for example, you may need to figure out how to perhaps work remotely or change your schedule up to allow for that, or find a room that you can rent or a space so you can be able to speak freely. For me, that was important. Even when we were working in a shared office workspace, if you will, we did need to have dedicated offices to have candid conversations, or potentially private and need to be secure conversations, and those just can't be had in the open. So looking at how we communicate today and realizing that this is a changing dynamic, and the environment in which we're communicating is really key. It's not just the words that we're using, it's the environment we're in. And that's really what I'm focusing in today, is you're looking at that and how you're showing up externally and things around you, and then how that affects how you're going to share, what you're going to share. So, we touched briefly on the traditional office setting. And then you have, for those of you biologists or engineers, or people that have to go out into the field, that's a whole nother environment, right? It's different. You're not sitting. You're oftentimes moving around. You're driving from place to place. Think about those ways that we can communicate, and think about safety and things like that too. Because oftentimes companies have, hey, you can't talk while you're on the road on company business for safety, even if you're hands-free. Sometimes that means you have to pull over, or you have to plan, where am I going to be in a place where I can communicate on the phone most likely, or maybe you have to send a text message, or maybe you need to send some kind of electronic communication, or maybe you actually need to get on a video conference call. It means you cannot be driving doing that. And think about the distractions that you're facing, the things that are popping up on your phone or other things like that. So it's one thing, we've got so many things that can draw us away, can distract us. I've been guilty of this and continue to have to be on guard. Any kind of communication, whether you're in the office, outdoors, working remotely, you have constant things that are popping up, cell phones, right? Other notifications. So think about how that affects how you communicate, how that affects your presence and your focus and your attention. Because if you're not being attentive and focused and listening or understanding, just listening to respond, that will definitely affect the impact and your effectiveness in communication. So getting back to this outdoors challenge, if you will, safety is again paramount. You're out there in the field because you're doing some kind of field work. And again, recognizing where you need to pause and stop, and you cannot be talking. For example, for me, that I've done a lot of field surveys for different wildlife and things like that, you cannot be talking on the phone and then focusing and getting a specific survey done. It requires all of your attention, and if you're trying to multitask, if you will, what we found is your effectiveness decreases, and the more we try to multitask, the greater our accuracy diminishes. So really consider that in your communication, because if you're trying to do multiple things, your brain is going and trying to focus on these things. You're not going to be as effective and present in your communication, and probably not going to make the impact you're hoping to. And sometimes we have to understand how we can adjust, right? There's all these different communication styles and ways of being. We need to know verbal and nonverbal, particularly when we're outdoors, right? We may not be able to talk with somebody. How do we show literally our hands, our body, how are we paying attention in ways we're relating to somebody? That could make a big difference. Hand to stop or to come forward, or people maybe use some colorful gestures to communicate they're upset with one another. Think about that before you unleash that communication style, and think about what the ramifications may come of it, right? There may be unanticipated damage may be coming from the way you're communicating. So it's important that we think about these things and prepared for when they do arrive, because they inevitably will, that we foster clear communication, we're effective, and we can adjust and pivot in dynamic and unpredictable settings, particularly outdoors, right? It's hopefully a little bit more consistent, and you can anticipate some things in the office setting or when you're working remotely, but outdoors can be a lot of variables in there. So you got to be prepared and how to communicate and adjust when things aren't going to plan. Again, this is all about knowing yourself, leading yourself well. If your team, here's an example I had recently of communication in the outdoors, which was a real problem for the leadership team, where we had a biologist in this case going into the field, and they didn't follow the safety communication protocols, letting them know that they were on site, they used the right tools. And what happened is it caused a cascading problem where now you have the safety team, if you will, or the scheduling team looking and saying, hey, this person hasn't checked in. There is a miss here. And they couldn't reach them. And then they had to go through the emergency contacts and try to get a hold of them, because they still couldn't reach this person, and they couldn't reach them. And they said, well, I believe that they're there. And so it was a lot of effort, energy, trying to find out what happened to this person. Eventually they did check in, but they didn't follow the protocols. And so that caused a whole slew of problems and time and effort and money because now all these people had to go be communicated, the client, the individual, the other crews that were waiting on this person. So it was just cascading like a domino. So if you understand and know this, like yourself, like, oh, I might need to be more proactive in my communication style. Create a checklist if you need it, right? Make sure that you're in cell service or you're at a good place where you can actually communicate and share with your team. This is all about leading yourself well and then helping lead others. So if you know that might be a problem for somebody on your team or you've dealt with that, let them know, give them heads up, help them be prepared for how to communicate in the environment that they find themselves in and do it successfully. Another one, in today's age is remote work, right? I mean, how many of you have seen the challenge of working remotely and communicating with others? It's not the words. The words are, but it's more about the environment we find ourselves in that can be conducive or non-conducive. How many of you had a pet while you're on a video call pop up? Because it's like, okay, well that just distracting. And sometimes it's okay. We understand things happen, but just understand that affects how you're communicating. Have you had you're working at home and, through COVID and some of you have still maybe homeschool your children and do you have a clear plan for them about when they can come in and interact with you if you're working from home in a remote environment? Are they being quiet? Do you have a place where you can focus and then give your attention when you need to communicate? Oftentimes in remote, we're not in an office and in the great outdoors, like I mentioned earlier, you may be working with people in the field together, but when we're not literally seeing each other face to face in the same physical environment, there's challenges there because a lot of times we're talking written communication, obviously, and that we lose verbal cues. We lose the ability to evaluate. There's a lot lost in the visual. So I would encourage you, if you're working in a remote environment or working really anywhere in which you can't physically be in the presence of another person, turn on your camera if you can. Be as visible as you can because that goes a long way in your communication. I know sometimes people like to have their cameras off, and I was that way. I was one of those people at that point. But I want to encourage you to flip the camera on, be the person that's visible. It will mean that you're present, you're engaged, they're seeing you look at the camera. That's why I record these videos of the podcast as well. So those of you that are listening on podcasts, if you want to actually see the podcast and see me, you can do that. I'm on YouTube. Look up Steward Your Business. I find communicating in today's age, we have to try all different forms and ways of doing it. There isn't one way of doing it. Now, you do need to find the preferred way of reaching your ideal client or your team. And then the effectiveness of what you're actually trying to communicate, meaning the words, the message, will be much better received. So, and you need to find, again, for the team, what works overall the best for the team. There is sometimes no perfect solution. Don't get me wrong. Before we started using Microsoft Teams, for example, we were using text messages in chats, if you will. And it's not that bad when it's one or two people, but when you're trying to get a bunch of people on a text thread, how many of you have had that? And you're like, I can't get off the text thread either. So that's a challenge, right? That we're struggling with. And so you're like, well, let's use Teams or let's use Slack or whatever the tool is. I'm tool agnostic, if you will, but I will help you in your looking at your team, looking at your organization, and seeing what works well. There's so many different ways to communicate and collaborate. And again, I've seen some work better than others, but really the tool that everyone adopts and uses the most is the one I go with. So whether it's Google Meet, whether it's using Asana to collaborate, whether it's Ring, I mean, there's all different ones. And I've used so many different ones. It's Facebook Messenger, what you name it, Workplace. it's the one that works the best and that everyone's engaging with. Again, getting back to remote work, right? We're looking about how do we get clearer in our communication, supporting one another, creating that culture, even virtually. And I can tell you, I've done it very successfully, where we had people working literally across the country for a small firm, and we found ways to be intentional in our meetings and our collaborations. So the remote work honestly can work very well, and I've seen it done. If you're struggling with that, I think some of firms right now are trying to find the balance of like, where do we have people come into the office and collaborate and communicate there? Where do we do it maybe in the field? Where do we do it remotely? It's a little bit of the wild west right now, and that's why I created Steward Your Business, to help business owners and their teams find out what works best for their company culture, their dynamic, the type of work they do. And if you're feeling like, David, this resonates with me, and I'm feeling like I at least like an audit or assessment because I'm getting different feedback from my team. Some want to come in the office and they feel it's great, others do not. And I'm kind of feeling like I'm navigating a potential civil war here. There is that very much going on right now in some organizations where they're being very hard-fisted. It's saying you must come in the office 5 days a week, and these are the times. And I think that's short-sighted in my personal opinion. But there are maybe some industries or some market sectors that really do need that. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying one way or another, but flexibility is important here. And understanding this continual evolution of communication in the environment as we find ourselves in, the tools that are out there. I worked for a company for quite a few years, which was very anti-social media. And I think that was short-sighted. I'm not saying everyone has to jump into every social media format out there. Don't get me wrong. Again, where are your clients? Where are your key people that you want to hire, right? Where are they communicating? What's the environment you find them in? I personally want to go and share my message and go to where my ideal clients are, right? I would love to say they'd all come and find me on my website and whatnot. That's just not going to happen. I mean, some may, don't get me wrong, but I have to go to them. I have to reach them where they're at. So finding out what is the preferred communication styles. Is it email? Is it video messaging? Is it Zoom? Is it Teams? Is it text messages? And then figuring out the environment in which these messages are being sent. Is it in the office? Is it working remotely? Is it working in the field? Because you're in the field most of the time. And so there's a dynamic there, and how we communicate. There's a lot of nuances here. And again, I can't solve all the problems on the podcast, but I can help at least illuminate these things. I want you to pay attention to them. So look at the environment you find yourself in the office, working outdoors, working remotely. And then when you look at that environment that you're in, consider the messaging that you're sending out. And then the medium, the format that it is, the channel, if you will, that you're using. Because that will have effect. And you may not even have realized how much of an effect that is. Whether you're like working remotely, you're like, I didn't even realize by me working remotely how that affected me in my meetings or my availability to be able to talk with folks. I hadn't met anybody in person in a long time. And the same thing, vice versa. You're working in the office and you're like, oh man, I didn't realize I was just coming in my office and not collaborating and stepping in the cubicle next door or interacting with others that were in the office to learn what was going on. I wasn't being intentional, right? And just think about how that cascades in the success of your business. As you focus in on these things, you will have greater success. And I can help you evaluate the tools. I can help you see what's working, what's not working, and then get you where you want to be. A healthy, holistic organization, supporting one another, having great conversations, collaborating, communicating, caring, celebrating. And so if this resonates with you and you're like, David, I want to know more, then reach out to me. I do free discovery calls. And for the month of March and April this year, so when you hear this podcast, we're in April or 2024, those of you that reach out to me, and I'll show one on the video here, I'm going to offer a free copy of the Communication Code book, which is a great book. So for those that you decide that, hey, this is something worthwhile, I'm interested and I want to meet with David, if you listen to this podcast and you catch this, it'll be coming out in March here, but all through April, I'll honor that as an opportunity to improve your communication and where you're communicating. So I'm glad you guys are back here. I'm going to continue to give you value and wisdom and from the trenches of my 20 plus years in the environmental consulting world, how I've communicated successfully in all these different environments, different companies. I hope you will come back, share this if it resonated with you. It's important to get your comments and feedback. I really appreciate your reviews. It means so much to me. And share with me what resonated with you. And hey, if you hear something like David, I'd love to know more about, another topic about leading myself well and help to lead my teams. I would love to speak on that. I hope you guys have an amazing week. Enjoy yourselves. Keep the communication on fire, whether you're in the office, whether you're outdoors, whether you're indoors, whether you are working remotely, wherever you are, think about your environment and think about how that affects your communication and how you can show up in a more powerful way, and realizing that words that you speak and the way that you show up is very, very powerful in how you lead yourself and your team. I appreciate you joining with me. Again, David Carr, the Intelligent Human Leadership Podcast. Until next time, have an amazing week. Take care. Bye-bye.